Welcome to part 4 of our series on yoga, mindfulness, and body-based interventions. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics. We're going to talk about mindful movement and about yoga. So our exercise for today is going to start with that mindful movement. So you might again take a moment, sit with your feet on the floor, nice tall spine. You can gaze down or close your eyes and take a moment to notice how your body feels. Maybe take a couple of slow, deep breaths. And then notice the sensations in your neck. And begin to drop your chin down towards your chest. Option, you can either start to look over one shoulder, bring your chin back to center, and look over the other shoulder, or turn this into full, slow circles. So you might circle out through your neck, and perhaps soften and release a little bit of the tension that you're holding there. If you're doing full neck circles, at some point change the direction and see if anything feels a little bit different. Take one more round. The next time your chin is tucked in towards your chest, stay there. And then bring your chin back parallel to the floor. Bring your awareness to your shoulders. And begin to roll your shoulders back and down. Again, keep this nice and slow and notice the sensations as you do this. You can do both shoulders or one at a time. And notice how this feels in your body. See if you can invite a little bit of tension to release from your shoulders. One more, and release. And then one more exercise to begin to warm up our body and pay attention to those sensations. We're going to inhale and bring our arms up overhead. You might even look up and do a little back bend. And then exhale and bring your arms back down. Take 2 more breaths this way. Inhale, lift up. Exhale, release your arms down. One more time, full breath in. Long exhale out. You might shake everything out for just a moment. And then pause and notice how your body feels after those couple of different gentle movements. So before we start to talk about yoga interventions, I think it's interesting to note that interventions are being done very differently in the United States compared to what's happening in India. So in the United States, we tend to focus a lot more on the asana or the movement part of the practice. For most of the United States, yoga is really thought of as more of a movement-based practice. Some people think of it mostly just as exercise. Some people are taking it a little bit deeper and getting into more of the theory and philosophy behind yoga. But in general, the asana or the movement-based part is what you're going to find when you go to a yoga class in the United States. Sometimes you will see some of the pranayama or breath work, and sometimes a little bit of meditation will also be introduced. However, it's interesting to note that in India, there's a much more holistic form of yoga that's being used as an intervention for mental health purposes. Yoga overall is seen more as a lifestyle. And when we look at yoga-based interventions in India, we're looking at something that's looking at changing the overall lifestyle of the individual to move towards a healthier state. So it's very interesting. Mental and physical wellness have a much closer association in India than they do in the United States. So just to note a couple of terms that are really important when we start to look at this topic. So trauma-informed means that our yoga exercise or whatever body-based intervention we're using is being performed knowing that some individuals in the group may have experienced some form of trauma. So for you yoga professionals out there, a trauma-informed yoga class can be taught by anyone who has a general understanding that people have experienced trauma. You don't need additional training to do that. However, trauma-sensitive yoga is very different. So when we're looking at trauma-sensitive yoga, our exercise or class or intervention is being performed with a group of people or one-on-one, specifically to work with that mental health diagnosis or that trauma issue. So a trauma-sensitive yoga class would be one that's taught by a person who has both that clinical experience, that master's degree in social work or psychology or whatever it is, as well as experience in training in yoga. So we're using that trauma-sensitive yoga class to assist people specifically with these issues. So a couple notes on some guidelines you might think of for trauma-sensitive yoga. If you're a clinician and you say that you're going to do yoga, please complete a yoga training. So it's very important, especially in the United States, that you represent yourself appropriately. If you say you're doing yoga, be trained in yoga, because in the United States especially, we see that people love to sue people for misrepresentation. So make sure you have both ends of that covered. Any therapist can use components of yoga. That is absolutely fine. Any therapist can use breathing techniques, pranayama. Just tell people to take some deep breaths. That's enough. Any therapist can have people do some gentle stretching, that you can have people be aware of tightness in their body, maybe in their shoulders, and roll out their shoulders and notice the difference. Any therapist can use body awareness exercises, even if you're not a trained yoga teacher. That is absolutely fine. Again, just don't call it yoga. Similarly, any yoga teacher can use components of trauma-informed yoga in your classes, and that will be helpful for all of the people in your class. If we're looking at these body-based interventions using yoga as a component of mental health treatment, the focus is going to be on the client's experience within the body. So many yoga classes or private yoga sessions are really focused on alignment, having the correct position of the body. But that's not what we're going to do if we're looking at using this for a mental health reason. Instead, the focus again is going to be on the internal experience. We're not worried about what's happening externally, and we are not using physical adjustments. So the Trauma Center is a place in Boston, Massachusetts that was started by David Emerson and really focused a lot on trauma-sensitive yoga. Their description of this methodology is based on central components of Hatha style of yoga. This is where participants engage in a series of physical forms and movements, but it might not be set up in that vinyasa flow that many people are expecting in the United States. There's going to be elements of a standard Hatha yoga that are going to be modified so that we can maximize the internal experience and the experience of empowerment so that our individual clients or students can cultivate a more positive relationship with their body. Even though we're still looking at physical forms and movements, our emphasis is, again, not on that external expression or appearance of the position. So we're not worried about it looking right. We're not worried about correct alignment in the same way. And we're not looking at having the student have an approval from an external teacher of you're doing this correctly. Instead, the focus is really on that internal experience. We want people to slow down and pay attention enough so that they can focus on what's happening in their own body. We want them to notice the body's experience in this moment. And then going beyond that, we also want people to be able to choose what to do with those sensations. We want people to be able to start to create their own agency by taking action and making choices for what's best for their body. So this shift in orientation from the external to the internal is that key attribute of trauma-sensitive yoga. And trauma-sensitive yoga is often that complementary treatment, that adjunctive treatment for trauma, anxiety, and depression, as well as other diagnoses. It's important to note that in this approach, the power resides within the individual, that client, that student. Again, not the yoga instructor. So we're not worried about the person doing everything exactly as the yoga instructor tells them to do. Instead, we're focusing on that felt internal sense in the body so that people can make choices and improve and restore the connection between their mind and body. So we've noted that a lot of people who've experienced trauma are very disconnected from the physical sensations in their body. They might not be able to notice their internal sensations, such as your stomach is getting tight, so maybe you're angry. They might not have a good sense of the space around them, so they might be a little bit clumsy. So we're trying to improve and restore that connection between the mind and the body. That also is going to help restore that sense of agency that is often taken away when trauma happens. So when there's a trauma, people's choices have been taken away from them. They did not have a choice of what happened to them in that situation. We're trying to give people small situations where they can start to make their own choices once again. And in that way, we're restoring some of that agency. So if you're teaching a trauma-sensitive class or a group, there's some things that you might think about as you're setting that up. So the first is just the room itself. So you might notice, are there mirrors in the room? We tend to want to avoid mirrors. We don't want people looking at their external form or making judgments about how they look. If you're stuck using a room that does happen to have mirrors, I would suggest turning away from the mirrors so it's behind them and they see them as little as possible. You want to make sure that there's good lighting, that people can feel like they can see what's happening around them. Often I see yoga teachers that will turn the lights off during that final rest in Shavasana. When I'm teaching a trauma-sensitive class, I'm not turning out the lights during that time period. I want people to still see what's happening around them. I might dim the lights a little bit, and if I do that, I'm going to say, as I do it, I'm walking over to the lights, and I'm going to dim them a little bit for your final rest, so that people can see and know exactly what's happening. You might think about the placement of the mat. How much space is there between people? Is there enough room for everyone to be able to comfortably stretch out their arms? Can everyone see you from where their mats are? And you also want to consider privacy. So you want to make sure that this is a setting where they can feel like they are not being watched or observed, and that it's a private setting. So one of my first trauma-sensitive yoga classes, we used a church that offered the space for free. But what happened was they put us in a somewhat public setting. They said, it'll be fine, no one's here at that time, no one's going to bother you. But we had this group of women who were exploring yoga for the first time, and all of a sudden a gentleman was walking through the middle of the room. And that happened more than once. So do you think those women felt safe in that they had privacy? They didn't. So we actually had to move to a different space so that they could have some privacy while they were exploring their trauma-sensitive yoga classes. Another thing to consider is, where are you? So in some yoga classes, you notice the yoga instructors walking around the room. They might be behind you, they might be in different places where people might not be able to see them. In our trauma-sensitive yoga, we're staying on the mat where everyone can see what's happening. And we're also doing the practice with them. We are doing all of the same movements as we're explaining and sharing them. So this is helping us to be more on an even level. So it's not teacher telling student what to do. It's we're all doing this together. And that's going to help with some of our key components that we're going to see in a later slide. Again, in a trauma-sensitive yoga class, we are not doing any kind of hands-on adjustments. You might verbally suggest alignment changes to the whole group, but you're not going to say something to one specific person. You're not going to say, Michelle, bring your knee back above your ankle. You're not going to point out one specific person. You could suggest to the whole class, everyone take a look down at your knee and see if your knee is right above your ankle. You're also going to be modeling this from your mat in the front of the room. If they don't change, that's okay. Let them make their own choices once again. Repetition is going to be very important to provide some familiarity and allow some time for people to start processing what their bodies are doing. Most people who are coming to a trauma-sensitive yoga class are new to yoga. It's not something they're familiar with. They don't know the different shapes and forms of what we're doing. So it's going to take time for them to get used to that enough to stop worrying about the position of their arms and their legs and to start feeling what's happening with their muscles and sensations inside their body. So we're going to have lots of repetition, we're going to repeat directions, we're going to rephrase directions, and we're going to do it over a series of time. So we might do a 6-week series, and we might do a similar class for that whole 6 weeks, just so people start to get to know what's happening, so that they can know what to expect, and then they can turn that attention, instead of looking at what's happening outside, they can turn that intention inside, pay attention to how their bodies feel, and make the choices that are good for them. Another thing that you might think about is the use of music. In India, music is generally not used during yoga classes. The idea is that you don't need that external distraction. In the United States, most classes will be using music. So if you are choosing to use music, think about what music you're using and why. So some of the things you might think about is this a song that might trigger someone? Is it going to have lyrics or a memory associated with it? So you might consider using songs that people don't know, maybe using instrumental music, or using something that's done in another language so that people aren't listening to the lyrics and getting distracted about that. So once I actually had a group of students that was trying to help me put together a playlist for a class that we were giving, and they put in some songs that were really not appropriate. So one of the songs that they put in was called Take Me to Church, and over and over and over again, this line is repeated, take me to church. But what we've noticed with a lot of our clients in the United States is that there's a lot of religious trauma. So if they're in the middle of a yoga session and they're being told to think about going to church, that might bring up a lot of triggers for people. So we had to rearrange, get rid of that song and put in some other stuff instead. So consider what you're using, consider how that might be associated. Try to keep music very neutral if possible. In our trauma-sensitive yoga classes, and you can also do this in your trauma-informed yoga classes, we're going to use more invitational language than you might see in other formats of classes. So often when we have our typical yoga class, in the studio or the gym, we're having a lot of very direct commands, basically. We're being told, step your right foot forward, lift your arms overhead, make sure your arms are straight. Very specific things that we're being told we have to do. In our trauma-sensitive class, and again, in your trauma-informed class, if you would like, we want to make this a little bit more gentle, and we want to consider using phrases that give the person permission to explore their bodies in these positions on their own terms. So we're not going to do this with every single idea. We're still going to have to say some things to get people more or less into the shapes and the positions we want them in. But you might give more choices. You might say things like, when you're ready, lift your arms over your head. You might say something like, explore where you feel sensations in your body as you're in this position. You might say, I invite you to, or you're welcome to give them permission to explore some different things. Perhaps if it feels good to you, you can add this other part on. Or you might say something like, you might notice sensation in such and such part of your body. So maybe they're in a position where the thigh is really engaged. You might cue their awareness to that part of their body, because again, they might not have awareness in their body that that's a place that something might be happening. One last note about language is we want to avoid the word pose. So we often talk about yoga poses, but the word pose can actually be quite triggering. So many people, especially when we're looking at childhood abuse or human trafficking, have been told to pose for the camera or pose for a person in a certain position. So instead of telling people to pose, maybe we might not tell them to take child's pose. We're going to use the word position or form instead. So take child's form. There's some specific topics or formats that you might consider using within both that trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive class. So grounding or centering is going to be done in most classes anyway. You might have more of an emphasis on this for a trauma-sensitive class, but we're basically looking at calming the nervous system down, creating that sense of self and where you are in relationship to the room. We're going to be looking at some ideas of relationship and reconnection, and this has two different parts. Part of it is that relationship, that having a shared authentic experience with another individual. This could be the yoga instructor, the yoga therapist, or even the other people in the room with them. That relationship can also be with themselves, that inner experience. So remember, we're using this to try to create safety in the body. So that reconnection, that relationship with the body is going to be very important. Another theme that we often look at is attunement. So you might think of this, or you might have heard of this more as mindfulness. But this is the idea that we are present in this specific moment. What's really cool about this is when we're working with mindfulness, that amygdala, that fear center actually starts to shrink. And when that starts to shrink, our prefrontal cortex, where we get to make those decisions, actually has room to get bigger. So in yoga, when we're taking away the fear, because we're making things very predictable, we're helping create safety in the body and with people around them, we're shrinking that amygdala, we're creating more space for those conscious decisions, which might be, I want to lift my arms overhead, or not. So that's one of the things that's actually happening in these yoga classes that you might not think about. We might have a theme of compassion in our class. So many people are very good at offering other people compassion. We want to help that compassion come towards themselves as well. So self-compassion is going to be really important. We're working on self-love. We're working on helping people feel worthy, accepting themselves, and having patience that this is a process. It takes time. And then again, we've talked a little bit about empowerment, making those decisions and making choices when you didn't have that choice before. So our empowerment is feeling capable of taking effective action and making choices. So you could choose to use all of these in one class. What we often do is we take one theme for one class. So our first class might be on grounding. Our second class might be on relationship. Or you can put it all into one class. Sometimes we'll do one at a time, and then our last class, class number 6, will combine all of these different ideas. But the more often you can reinforce these themes, the more that's going to help the individual. If you'd like to read a little bit more about this, we actually did publish an article on this. This was a couple of us through the Grand Rapids Healing Yoga. So it was myself, Rachel Morrow, and Kelly Climby have published an article on the GRACE format. You are welcome to take a look at that. So Judith Herman is one of my favorite trauma therapists. And she states that no intervention that takes power away from the survivor can possibly foster her recovery, no matter how much it appears to be in her or his immediate best interest. So I often will teach this in front of social work students, and I give them this question for thought. How can we use yoga to give power to a survivor? So again, this goes back to that idea of choices, that when trauma happened, the choices were taken away. Now we're going to give people choices, and it doesn't matter if those choices are good or bad or whatever they are. Sometimes they're just neutral. But sometimes as our yoga professionals, we might notice something that we think is not great alignment. So maybe they're in a warrior one and we see their knee going beyond their ankle. It is more important for that survivor to be able to make that choice and have control over their body than it is for us to make sure that they get their knee right above the ankle. In the long run, having that position slightly out of alignment a couple of times is probably not going to hurt that person. But it can be harmful if we're going around telling people that they're doing something wrong, because they already think that. So we want to give them choices. Now, one thing that you could do is you could suggest or model to the entire group, everyone look down, make sure your knee is right above your ankle. That's fine. That's not singling anyone out. That's still allowing the person to decide if they want to make that change or not. But again, we're not pointing out anyone individually. We're not going to come around and do any of that physical adjustments. We're just going to let it be. A couple of times is not going to hurt that person. Okay, so one of the things that is interesting when we're looking at yoga-based therapy is how our positions and our breath change our nervous system. So I started with yoga therapy thinking, I just need to find the correct series of positions for anxiety. And then I need to find the correct series of positions for trauma. And it doesn't really work that way. But there are a couple things that do tend to work with the nervous system. Breathing is the biggest and the easiest one. So again, we've talked about this a couple times. We stimulate our sympathetic system with our inhales. That's preparing us to do something. We stimulate our parasympathetic system with an exhale. So an emphasis on a nice long exhale is really useful for most people. We do note that we need to make sure that these things are tailored for each individual person because everyone's a little bit different. So one of the things that I learned that was surprising to me, I didn't know, is that military workers are taught that when they're squeezing a trigger on a gun, they should be exhaling. So if their association with exhaling is that they are trying to shoot and harm someone, that is not going to put them into their parasympathetic nervous system. So we might need to find some different forms of breath work for that individual or those people. So that's one of the things that I like to know about the clients I work with. Do you have a military background? In general, we have found that forward folding, bringing your head below your heart, can help the body to slow down. So this is really good for anxiety. It's also really good for sleep. So if I'm teaching a class for people who have a lot of anxiety, we're going to be doing a lot of forward folding activities, and we might also be doing some legs up the wall. On the other end, depression has a very different set of things that can be useful. So most of the time, if you see someone's depressed, they tend to have a posture that's kind of curled in. They're looking down and away from people. They're kind of trying to disappear a little bit. So in depression, we want to bring our shoulders back and we want to open our heart. So we're changing that posture. That brings more energy into the body, which most people with depression need because they're not feeling like they want to do a lot. But it's also creating space. So another position that I love doing with people who've had a lot of issues with depression is anything where you get really big, because they're used to trying to be really small, and we're trying to change those patterns. So those are a couple of specifics that might work with our nervous system. But overall, again, our goal is to focus on allowing people to find sensation in their own bodies and to learn how to make choices to take care of themselves. We want to give them as much empowerment as possible. It is important to note that when we're looking at trauma therapy, right now, most body-based interventions, they're being used as adjunctive treatments. So this means that they're also doing other treatment at the same time. And in addition to that other treatment, they're working on a body-based intervention. So I've personally found that it helps to separate these two things out. So you could have an individual with a separate therapist, a primary therapist, and then they're going to see a yoga therapist for the body-based intervention. You could have someone who is working with you individually as a therapist for one-on-one sessions, and then they're coming to a group yoga class for the other body-based intervention parts. What I see getting a little bit messy is if you try to be the same, if you try to combine the two, you try to do body-based interventions as well as the other therapeutic interventions in the same session, one takes over the other and both pieces don't happen. So I like to either have people come see me for their one-on-one sessions and then come to my group sessions, or see another therapist to do their more traditional talk-based therapy, and then they come and see me to do an individual yoga session. So both of those can work. Just try to separate it a little bit so that there's more of a distinction of what's happening in the different sessions. And that is the end of our session on trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive yoga. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you in the next section.